for a few minutes, and obviously I've come into the wrong room because all of a sudden I'm at a game show. We got the Price is Right going on up here. We got guys walking off with TVs, grills, you know, prizes for family members. Had I known, I would have been here for all 8 as well. But Curtis, thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this. I am fairly new to Baton Rouge, and your warm welcome really means a lot to me because it's a whole lot better than what I got here a couple years ago when I moved to Louisiana. I was driving down from Washington, D.C., where I had lived for 18 years. I lie now that I'm here. I tell people I'm from Thibodaux, but that's not true. My wife is from Thibodaux, and that's why I'm here. But I was driving down from D.C. to move here, and I get stopped at the state line. Now, I've already been driving about 21 hours straight to get here to be with my wife, and I get stopped at the Louisiana line by the state police, and I know I wasn't speeding, so I had no idea what this was all about. The guy obviously saw my license plates. He saw the DC plate, and he said, "Sir, there's a 3-prong test if you're going to be moving here." And I said, "No one ever told me about this, sir." I thought it was a good idea to call him sir. And he said, "The first test, the first question is, are you an LSU Tigers fan?" Oh, man, I was so relieved because when I was a little kid, I was a ball boy for the Baltimore Colts football team at a time when Burt Jones, former LSU quarterback, was the star quarterback of the team. So I learned about Louisiana at a very young age from Burt, and I learned specifically about the LSU Tigers, so I could check that one off. And he said, "Well, don't worry, we got 2 more. Do you eat gumbo?" Thank you. Yes, sir, I do. Chicken gumbo specifically. My wife's been cooking it for me for years. We go back and forth between D.C. and here. 2 down, and I'm just thinking, please don't let the 3rd one be any harder. He says, "Will you please spell for me Atchafalaya?" So, you can probably understand why I feel good when people are nice to me here. It was a tough entry point. But this Men's Health Conference is incredibly impressive. And you know, normally when we think of men's health, we think of the physical parts to health. But I want to talk a little bit more. There's so much more to men's health, in my opinion, than the physical. There's the emotional, the psychological health, and I would say the spiritual well-being. These are all critical issues, critical to ourselves, to our families, to our communities, even critical to our economy. Now, I was doing some research on this recently, and the price tag that they put on this, the indirect and direct costs of mental and emotional health issues in this country, $100 billion a year. That's a staggering price tag. And I would submit to you that a lot of what goes on there with those issues can be tied back to a couple of the most simple, basic questions we could possibly ask ourselves. And yet they're questions that we give virtually no attention to whatsoever. Questions such as, what does it mean to be a successful man in this culture? How do we even define masculinity? What is it that we're all striving to be in this world? If we don't take the time to think those issues through and define them for ourselves, then how in the world are we possibly going to reach what we want to be if we're not even defining it before we try to get there? I want to offer a few thoughts on those questions. I want to try to help answer some of those questions. And I want to do it within the context of sharing with you 2 football stories of all things. Because I've spent a good portion of the last 8 or 9 years doing research and writing and speaking around the country on sports-related issues and how they tie into our culture overall, but specifically to boys and men. Pretty natural for here, I guess, football season about to begin, and after all, even at a men's health conference, doesn't matter where we are, right? Eventually everything's going to lead back to football, I guess, right? What I'd like to do is start with that word success, because if we're going to ask ourselves, what does it mean to be a successful man? What I want to do is ask you to participate for just a minute in a little mental exercise, if you would. If you would go to that part of your brain in which you keep your definitions of words or concepts, And if possible, at least for the next 40 minutes or so, just wipe out of your mind whatever definition you carry of the word success. And I want to redefine that for you. But I'm not going to give you a new definition. I'm actually going to give you the oldest definition of all. Years ago, in D.C., Library of Congress, right down the street from where I lived, I went one day because I was curious about what had happened to this word success through the years, and I found the original Webster's Dictionary, published in the year 1806, same year Lewis and Clark completed their expedition. If you wanted to know back then what it meant to be a successful man, it was defined by only 4 words. And those 4 words were prosperous, fortunate, happy, and kind. Now think about those last 2 for just a second. Fully 50% of that original definition. I guarantee you, if you go home today and pick up a dictionary off the shelf, you will no longer find happy and kind anywhere in the definition of success. What happened to those words? When were they excised and why? What has replaced those words? If you would take that definition of the word success and place it on an imaginary banner over everything else that I say this morning, I think that'll get us exactly where we want to be. All right, this first football story. I call it my season of life. Season of Life is the title of a book that I wrote in 2003. Season of Life is a book about a man named Joe Ehrmann. Joe was an NFL football player back in the 70s and the 80s. In fact, he was a teammate of Burt Jones on those teams in Baltimore. Burt was the captain of the Colts offense, and Joe was the captain of the Colts defense. Defensive lineman, big rowdy guy, all pro out of Syracuse, all American when he was in college. Not only a leader on the field, but also a leader off the field. A party guy, too. A big 1970s party guy. If you wanted to know where the team was going to hang out, you go find out from Joe. Many years later, I would reconnect with Joe, and we're going to get to that piece in just a moment. But I was so fortunate as a boy to be around people like a Burt Jones, like a Joe Ehrmann, because I was able to learn so much from them as a kid. It's also a book about a program Joe runs now called Building Men for Others. That comes down to that definition of masculinity that we're talking about. Joe has a concept. His concept is that we are teaching boys and men every single day in our culture what he calls false masculinity. False masculinity has 3 lies to it. The first one at the youngest age is athletic ability. We're led to believe that if we can hit the baseball, run and throw and catch, shoot the basketball better than the other boys, that somehow we are more manly than they are. We are elevated into believing that we're something more than the other boys. Get a little older, and the second lie comes into play: sexual conquest. I'm not talking about healthy relationships. There's nothing better in the world than a healthy relationship. I'm talking about what I call this notch in the belt mentality. I'm talking about the concept that for a young boy or a young teenager or a man later, the idea that that is all about bringing the girls and the women around to serve your purposes and needs and desires. That has nothing to do with them. That doesn't make you a man. If anything, that makes you a user of other people. Lie number 3 comes into play when you're a little older. Economic success. What kind of car do you drive? How much money is in your bank account? What's your house look like? What's your job title? These are all issues that revolve around power and privilege and prestige. That's an absolute lie, too. That has nothing to do with being a man of substance and impact. Now, I'm not here to tell you that those are bad things to want in your life. There's nothing inherently wrong with those things. But there is something terribly wrong if that's what you are going to use as your definition of what it means to be a man. If that is your definition, you're going to end up with a whole lot of loneliness in the solitude that comes with the end of a day. If you're going to call that false masculinity, you've got to replace it with something. Joe calls it strategic masculinity. It's got to be thought out, it's got to be defined, and then you have to live into that definition. Relationships and the cause. a cause beyond yourself. Those are the only two pieces to strategic masculinity. Relationship starts off being a lot easier for the women than it is for the men. But ultimately, that's the concept that you have the ability to look another man or woman in the eye and to express your love and then to feel and experience that love coming back. I'm not talking about beer commercial kind of love, you know, where you're watching a ball game, feet up on the table, and you know your team wins a touchdown, scores a touchdown and win the game. You slap each other on the back. This is great. Love you, man. Yeah. I'm talking about sincere, meaningful love that changes who you are and what your life is all about. And then a cause beyond yourself. A cause can be large, it can be small. You can have multiple causes or a single cause. But either way, this is the idea that if I were to walk out of here today and get hit by a bus, and I were on my deathbed tonight, I would want to look back over the relationship piece and ask myself questions such as, what kind of husband was I? What kind of father? What kind of son? What kind of brother? What kind of teammate? What kind of classmate? What kind of citizen out in the community? These are all relationship questions. And then that cause question is, what did I do to somehow, in some way, leave this world a better place? The strangest thing for me about this book, the Season of Life book, is that it's one I never set out to write. What happened was, back in 2001, I was reading my newspaper at breakfast in D.C., saw a little item on the sports page that said Memorial Stadium in Baltimore was about to be torn down. That was my childhood home away from home during all those years that I worked for the Colts. So I had a very emotional response to that. I wanted to walk through the place one more time before it was gone. I went up there on a cold January morning, walked through that stadium for about an hour, underneath, through the stands, on the field, the whole deal. And that gave me a lot of memories, but it wasn't about the building. It was about the guys who had filled it with life, the players and the coaches who had meant so much to me. I set off on a journey as a writer and as a human being because I wanted to find as many of those guys as I could. In the 10 years I was with the Colts from 74 to 83, it turns out there were 212 men who played at least part of one season during those 10 years. The journalist in me was determined to find as many of them as I could. None was more important than the 85th guy I was able to track down. It was this man, Joe Ehrman. Now, I hadn't spoken to Joe for 18 years. Our first phone call in 18 years, and I was absolutely blown away to learn about what he was doing now in 2001. Joe was no longer the party guy. Joe was now a minister. He was pastor of a church in Baltimore with about 4,000 members. He had started an inner city ministry called The Door, started a program called Mission Baltimore, which is all about racial reconciliation in a city that desperately needs help and hope in that area. Oh, by the way, Joe says, as we're getting ready to finish our phone call, I'm also coaching a little high school football on the side. I was stunned by that. I got off the phone and I kept asking myself the question, if I learned so much from this guy when I was a kid, what might I learn from him now? What I learned was the only reason he was coaching high school football on the side was because he thought that was a perfect context in Baltimore in which to implement this Building Men for Others program to work with boys. I went up to Baltimore in August of that same year because I wanted to see what it was Joe was doing. Just a one-day little 45-minute drive from D.C. up to Baltimore to see the first day of summer football practice for Joe's high school team. And here's what I saw. Joe's the defensive coordinator, a man named Biff Poggi, the head coach. The very first words of that first team gathering of the season went like this. The boys were sitting in the grass in the end zone at one end of the field. A high school football coach, Biff, was standing before them with the other assistant coaches standing behind him. And Biff yelled out to those boys, "What is our job?" And the boys yelled back in unison, "To love us." "What is your job?" And the boys yelled back, "To love each other." In unison. I thought it was about the weirdest thing I had ever seen on a field of play in sports, especially high school football, this tough guy game. Well, I came to learn that that exchange was the signature exchange that represented everything else that these guys were doing with these boys. it was as much a part of Gilman football, that's the name of the school, it was as much a part of Gilman football as blocking and tackling and scoring touchdowns. Now, Joe and Biff teach a lot of football. Trust me, these guys are good with the X's and O's. But aside from that, their playbook for these boys is filled with primary concepts, teaching points for them throughout the season, the focus of everything they're doing, concepts such as empathy, high school football, empathy, integrity, inclusion, justice, living a life of service to others, bringing all your talents both on and off the field, kindness, high school football, kindness. I expect greatness out of you, Joe once told the boys. I heard him tell this to the boys in a team meeting. I expect greatness out of you, and the only way we define greatness is the impact you have on the lives of others. If you would put that definition of greatness up on this same imaginary banner with that definition of success, that's a unique philosophy. It leads to many memorable moments for those boys and their coaches. None is more memorable than the last game of the season. See, what they do is every week, 4 hours before kickoff, I don't know what the other team's doing in its locker room, but when the Gilman boys and their coaches get together, they have a session called Building Men for Others 101. And what they do is either Joe or Biff teach. It has nothing to do with what's going to happen with the X's and the O's, the offense or the defense. It's all about these concepts, and each week it's something else. But none is more powerful, no lesson more powerful than that last week of the season. They have a tradition there now. The boys on that team, the senior boys on that team, are given an assignment the beginning of that week. It's called McDonough Week because they always play their conference rival, McDonough, the last game in the season. I don't know what the McDonough guys are focused on. I don't know if they're over there thinking about the fact that Gilman has won 8 out of 9 conference championships, or the fact that 4 of those 9 years Gilman was ranked #1 in the entire state of Maryland, or that 2 of those years they were in the national rankings put out by USA Today. I don't know if McDonough guys are scared by any of that or thinking about any of that. I don't know what they're doing. But the Gilman boys, it's their day to experience each other's lessons instead of the coaches teaching them. Each boy has been given an assignment to write an essay, each senior boy, how I want to be remembered when I die. In effect, what they're doing is they're writing their own obituaries as teenage boys. What that does is it allows them to put into writing that ending point of where they want to be and who they want to be based on everything else that has been built into them during that season. I've been there for a few of those sessions, a few different years. I absolutely believe, no one will ever convince me otherwise, than the fact that if every high school in America, I don't mean every football team, every high school in America had a program like Building Men for Others, and every high school in America had as its final exercise teenage boys thinking through, writing through, and then speaking through to their peers their own obituaries, I truly believe that in 5, 10, 20 years from now, we would literally be living in a different world, not only as men, but as a culture overall. There's also my own personal thread to this season of life journey, and that's why I call it a season of life journey, not just a book, because it went so far beyond that for me. See, I got tricked in 2001. I thought I was going there for one day. I got drawn in. I ended up spending the whole season with those coaches and those boys. Well, I got tricked again, because at first I thought I was just going to be an observer. I ended up being a participant. You can't help but be drawn in if you're around these guys and their lessons and these relationships that are developed between the coaches and the boys with each other. So I went through my own examination during this time period, my own inner exploration. I went through those pieces, the relationships piece, the cause piece. The cause was easy for me to tick off on my list. See, my little sister Wendy had a transplant when she was 22 years old, a liver transplant. And because of that, Wendy and Carl Lewis, the Olympic champion, and I, the three of us together, formed a foundation in Wendy's name, the Wendy Marx Foundation for Organ Donor Awareness. And we committed ourselves to working on that issue across the nation for years to come, and that's exactly what we did. Nothing ever made me more proud as a human being than introducing my little sister Wendy all over the nation as living, breathing, smiling proof that organ donation works. There was my cause piece. Then I started looking at my relationships, and I explored them all. Friendships, family relationships, spiritual, and it all came back to one for me. It came back to my dad. I could not stop thinking about my dad and our relationship. Now, I always knew my dad loved me. There was never any question about that. But it wasn't because he told me. That's something he didn't tell me until I was 23 years old. He said it once in a phone call, and then he hung up really quickly. And then, by the way, the phone rang again about 5 minutes later. And it was my sister Wendy, who was in college at the time. Wendy said to me, "What is going on with Dad?" I said, "What do you mean?" "Well, he just called me to tell me that he told you that he loved you." Wendy said, "He hasn't been telling you that all along?" I said, "No," and she's like, "Well, he's been telling me." I don't think he loved her more. Maybe. He probably had good reason to. But he just couldn't articulate that to his son. Wendy had a great response years later. My dad asked Wendy a question once, on the phone again. "Hey, how's it going with Jeff and Leslie?" Leslie's now my wife from Thibodeau. "How's it going with Jeff and Leslie?" "Hey, Dad, I've got an idea for you. Why don't you ask him?" These are not all natural concepts for men, even for fathers and sons. So I knew that that relationship needed work. Look, my dad was awesome, but his emotional thermometer stuck right in the middle, just like a weatherman. No highs, no lies, just no lows. Just keep that thing straight down the center. You're a man, keep your head down. Don't lead with the heart, lead with the head, because you know, as men, we're supposed to sever that connection. They're only 17 inches apart, but cut that thing loose and pull them as far apart as he can possibly go as a man, right? That was my dad, a stoic. Nothing wrong with that, just different. I needed something more. So I went up Thanksgiving weekend of that season, 2001. I told my dad I was coming. He knew I was coming up to New York, but he didn't know what was coming. We had an incredible conversation that lasted 3 or 4 days that weekend, and it still goes on to this day. That dialogue continues to this day. My relationship with my dad is absolutely incredible, and it is so, so different than anything we had before. Now, why do I say that this changes lives and families and communities and a nation as a whole, potentially? Unfortunately, to give the single strongest example of that, I have to share with you the absolute worst experience of my life, and I'll keep it short. It doesn't bring me a whole lot of positive energy to get into this. But my sister got really sick again in 2003. Same hepatitis B virus that had destroyed her liver. That uninvited poison had never left her body. It flared up again in 2003. Wendy got very sick again and needed another transplant, again to save her life. This time, because of the horrible shortage of donors, we were never able to find a liver for Wendy. On October 28th of 2003, I held my little sister and best friend as she took her final breath in this world. Now, as I say, there's not a whole lot of positive to take out of an experience like that, but there are these two threads that I can hold on to and tug on every single day, because there's not a day that goes by that I don't think about them. The first is that in that hospital bed that day, my sister that I had to say goodbye to, I knew for a fact that I had never crossed paths with another human being in my life who was more a person built for others than my sister Wendy. Her relationships were so incredible, so deep and rich and meaningful. Her cause for 14 years touring this nation to reach people about the very issue that ultimately led to her death. That was my sister Wendy. That makes me incredibly proud as a brother, and to carry on her work in the name of our foundation. The second piece, I have this image of my dad, this picture in my mind that I can see every single day of him with us in that hospital room on that day. And I know this, that but for the fact we had been through this experience for a couple years with this building men for other stuff, I know my dad, no way he could have been so physically and emotionally present in that room the way he was for my sister during those final days. And for me. That meant the world to me. That's powerful stuff. And what it proved to me is that we never, ever stop learning, even as adult men. Even when we get to that point where we kind of think we have it all figured out, we never stop learning. We never stop losing out on opportunities. We never stop missing chances to love and to be loved and to create and build and grow and foster and flourish in our relationships. That's the kind of stuff that Joe Ehrman came to my family with on a football field in Baltimore. So what does it mean to be a successful man? Relationships and a cause. The second football story I want to share with you is featured in my new book called The Long Snapper, and it's a local story. When I got here to Louisiana, once I worked my way past that state cop at the border there, I made a decision pretty early on that my first book project I wanted to do as a Louisiana resident, I really wanted it to be a local story. I felt like that would be a way for me to learn about the community more in a way that the community might learn about my work, and just a way to kind of be someone who is part of Baton Rouge. A lot of you may have heard of a guy named Brian Kinchin, or the Kinchin family, pretty well known here in football circles. Gus Kinchin, Brian's dad, of course, was one of the original 11 Chinese bandits on the 1958 national championship team at LSU. Gus's brother, Gary, also played for LSU. Two of Gus's sons, Brian and Todd, great careers at LSU and then long careers in the NFL. Brian's oldest son, Austin, now a sophomore at LSU and a walk-on on the football team as well. So that makes the Kinchins the first family ever to have 3 straight generations play for LSU. And then there are the wives. Gus's wife, Toni, was a cheerleader at LSU and the darling of LSU twice. She won it twice in a row. They had to change the rule to give someone else a chance. True story. And then Brian gets to LSU. What does he do? He marries a cheerleader, Lori. And yes, Austin is now dating a cheerleader at LSU. So it's no surprise that the Kinchins have been often referred to as the first family of LSU football. But my story specifically starts on December 15, 2003. Now at that time, Brian was done with football. He had played 13 years in the NFL as a tight end and a long snapper for 4 different teams. Never made a big name for himself, but 13 years in the NFL is a heck of a run. Brian had retired from his first career football and returned to Baton Rouge, where he was born and raised, had become a school teacher at Parkview Baptist. I'm sure some of you know the story. He was teaching a 7th grade Bible class on December 15, 2003, a husband, a father of 4, a teacher. His cell phone rings in his pocket while he's teaching, doesn't recognize the number. It ends up being Scott Pioli from the New England Patriots, Bill Belichick's right-hand guy in the front office. Pioli's desperate. Belichick's desperate. They need a long snapper because there's only 2 weeks left in the season, and their long snapper got hurt, the guy that snaps the ball for punts and field goals and extra points after touchdown. That's a weird job. It's the most unusual, most obscure job in all of professional sports. You're basically earning a living looking upside down at the world. You're bent over at the waist, grabbing a football, throwing it backwards through your legs. And if it's a punt, you got to get it 15 yards on a dime into the punter's hands, and you better be able to do that in under 0.8 of a second, because otherwise you're not good enough for the NFL. You also better do it right every single time. 99 out of 100 probably lands you back on your couch. 100 out of 100 is perfection. What perfection gets you is anonymity, because no one knows who you are if you do that job right. The only time they ever say your name on TV is if you screw something up, right? So it's a weird job. And Brian had a lot of mixed feelings as to whether he wanted to go back. He had some painful memories of his football career. That was a part of the reason why he struggled with the idea of going back. Yes, he was excited to have this second chance, Yes, he was excited when he learned from one of the kids in his class that the Patriots happened to be 12-2 at the time. See, Brian didn't even know that. He hadn't been following the NFL. That's how painful his memories were. He had to divorce himself from the whole scene. The memories were painful because Brian never felt like he had been affirmed or validated or received that stamp of success for which he had always been striving. He was defining himself by performance-related affirmation. How are you affirmed and validated by an NFL player? Well, it's probably if you win a Super Bowl ring, or you make the Pro Bowl, or you make the winning catch at the end of the game. If you reach those highlight moments, that's the kind of stuff that Brian had always been seeking. So he was conflicted. He was conflicted when he had to make that decision about going back, and they only gave him a couple hours. Pioli said, I'll call you back in a couple hours. Brian hangs up the phone. These 7th grade kids, 12 and 13-year-olds, they're wondering what in the heck is going on. When Brian explains it to them, they're pretty excited. It's not often that a Bible class turns into a free-for-all, but this place went kind of nuts. Brian made a big mistake. He let the kids vote whether he should go or not. They liked Brian, but they thought it was pretty cool to think about their teacher going to be a professional football player. The vote was unanimous, by the way. So Brian got on a plane that day, went to Boston, has a tryout the next morning. Belichick signs him, and at the very moment he completes signing his name, he becomes two things: the oldest guy on the New England Patriots at the age of 38, and the only player in the entire National Football League who just the day before was teaching a 7th grade Bible class. Brian had some tough experiences during this 7-week odyssey that ensued. You know, there they were. Bill Belichick, genius coach, genius. Tom Brady, star quarterback, cover of Sports Illustrated, but also the cover of GQ. These guys had it all. Teddy Bruschi at linebacker, and they just kept winning and winning. Oh, and Brian Kinchin, every man at long snapper. But he didn't do it perfectly. And so people, unfortunately, within the organization started paying a little more attention to him than he was comfortable with. And he really started struggling. Internally, he just basically lost it all. It got so bad for Brian in the days leading up to the Super Bowl. He had thrown a bad snap in a playoff game against Tennessee. Nothing that hurt the team, but enough to just drive him crazy. He became obsessed. You know, in golf, they call it getting a case of the yips. Brian had the football equivalent of the yips. He ends up in his hotel room in Houston, site of the Super Bowl. They're there for a week before the game. He ends up taking a football and his helmet back to the hotel room with him so that at night he can pile up stacks of pillows against the wall and practice alone in his hotel room, looking at the world upside down, snapping this football over and over, trying to figure out what in the world is going on with something he had done perfectly for 13 years, and now he was on the brink of disaster. All Brian could see in his mind's eye, and this was not exactly Norman Vincent Peale kind of stuff. This was not the power of positive thinking. His image was from the year before. A guy named Trey Junkin had come in for the New York Giants in a similar situation after an injury. He ended up throwing a bad snap in the last seconds of a playoff game against the 49ers. It cost the New York Giants their season. Now, I know the New York media, that's a bunch of fun-loving, you know, kind, gentle people. They treated Trey Junkin with kid gloves. Not really. And Brian knew all about that, and he actually had this image playing in his mind of that bad snap from a year before, only now he's not just going to be in some playoff game, he's going to be on the grandest stage of all in American sports, the Super Bowl. Well, that was a game between the Patriots and the Carolina Panthers. It was in Houston, Super Bowl 38, and everyone was predicting it was going to be this low-scoring, close game because both teams had tough defenses and not as much offense as they usually like to see in a game like the Super Bowl. So what happens? Everyone walks around that week in the hotel. Hey, Kinch, man, it's going to come down to you. It's going to be on you, big guy. And Brian's begging people to leave him alone. He's freaking out. The Wednesday before the Sunday Super Bowl, things get so bad for him, he has the worst practice of his 14 years. His snaps are going everywhere but where they need to be. He goes back to the team hotel, and comes to a decision that is absolutely stunning to imagine from a professional athlete. He calls Scott Pioli in his hotel room, the same guy who had called him 7 weeks earlier, and says, "Scott, I'm leaving. You got to get another guy. I can't do this to you and your team. I can't do this to the guys, the players, and the coaches. You got to get another long snapper." Pioli, when I talked to him for the research of this book, told me it was like talking a guy in off the ledge. And I don't mean that literally, but I do mean it figuratively. That's how far gone Brian was. Pioli talked him into staying. The game turns into not a defensive struggle, but an offensive shootout. Close. In fact, in the closing minutes, the score is tied at 29-29. The Patriots get the ball back with just over a minute left. Tom Brady has the ball and the chance to win the game. Brian Kinchin is on the sideline praying that Brady gets him, literally praying that Brady gets him in the end zone so it doesn't come down to a field goal. Brady doesn't get in the end zone. 9 seconds left. The Patriots are in position for a 41-yard field goal. 9 seconds left. Timeout. Out comes the field goal unit. Brian Kinchin, the snapper, the anonymous number 46 in your game program, Ken Walter, the punter, who is also the holder for the kicking unit, and Adam Vinatieri, the one guy of the three that anybody who follows football has heard of. 9 seconds left. This is about to be either one of the most exciting finishes in the history of the Super Bowl or Brian's nightmare come true. The biggest GOAT possibly in the history of the Super Bowl. And guess what? He did see one last time that image of Trey Junkin, even while he was getting ready to throw that snap. That is not where you want to be as a professional athlete. Brian relied on two things. He relied on 13 years of perfection before it, knowing what to do and just giving himself over to the physical part. And then he also relied on his faith, giving himself over in a much bigger, broader way. The snap was perfect, the hold was right where it needed to be, and Vinatieri's kick split the uprights. Brian wasn't done with his anxiety yet, though, because the first thing that came to his mind was, oh God, what if there's a penalty flag down? He quickly surveys the field, no yellow laundry on the field. He lets out a primal scream unlike anything that's ever emanated from his body. Brian was a Super Bowl champion, and he had his hands on the ball for the winning play in the game. But his story's still not done, because I knew Brian. I knew him tangentially, slightly back then in '03, and I had been following this. And there was a time that Brian even asked me later, do you think you might want to write something about this? You want to write this story? I didn't quite see it as being a book. Maybe a newspaper article, a long magazine piece, but it was only when I moved to Baton Rouge and got to spend more time with Brian, we really became friends, and I understood so much more about the man and the journey rather than just the sports narrative. Here's what I came to find out, and the part that intrigued me and why I ended up writing the book. Because Brian's journey was not done in Houston with 9 seconds left. In fact, that was only the beginning. He gets this Super Bowl ring. He comes back to Louisiana. Remember now, this is a guy that had to feel whole as an athlete. Something was missing. In a broader sense, he had to feel whole as a man. Something was missing. He thought it was going to be this validation, this affirmation, this stamp of success, this ultimate piece of glory in that third lie that Joe Ehrman would call the economic success piece, right? Funny thing happened, though, kind of paradoxical. Brian came to realize that the one thing he wanted so badly was something he never needed in the first place. He gets home with that Super Bowl ring and over time comes to realize it has not changed him one iota. If he wasn't enough of a man without it, how could he possibly now be enough of a man with it? Over time, as he uses that ring as a platform to go out and work and impact the lives of young people, Brian comes to realize even more than that. He comes to understand that that ring, it's not even about him as he thought it would be. The only true value of it is using that platform it's given him to work with kids in schools, churches, youth groups all over the state, to share his messages, which ultimately his story comes down to not a story that's a sports narrative, but a story about relationships and a cause, a story about the true measure of a man. In the end, a story about the difference between success, that word we still have up on our banner, and significance. The one that I would submit to you is the only one of the two that's going to matter in the end. Not success, as our culture is defining it for you, but significance. See, that's not about winning a Super Bowl. That's not about this ring that is the most ridiculous looking thing you've ever seen anyway. 105 diamonds. It's just huge. I call it a doorstop or a hood ornament, but certainly not anything you want to wear as jewelry. But see, it's relationships and a cause, and I think that's the only way, in my view of the world, toward the kinds of men's health that goes beyond the physical. Emotional health, psychological health, spiritual well-being. I think it all starts with that 1806 success that we have on our banner, and then it comes down to this. It comes down to those two pieces that Joe Ehrman introduced me to: relationships and a cause. Gentlemen, thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate it.